Hello, everyone, or no, as is said in the Musqueam language. I am delighted to welcome you here today for a very exciting webinar. I want to first begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and feel the great privilege it is to be able to live, work, and play on these lands. My name is Mariana Brusoni. I'm the Director of HELP and a professor in the UBC Faculty of Medicine. HELP's offices sit on the lands of the Musqueam people at the UBC Vancouver campus, but our work extends across all of the lands of all the nations in BC. And at HELP, we recognize the long road ahead of us on the path to reconciliation and decolonization of our work. We feel so fortunate to have the wisdom of the Aboriginal Steering Committee to guide us in this important work. I would invite each of you to, in the chat, acknowledge the territories that you're joining from and just briefly introduce yourselves. Now, today, we are greatly excited and privileged at HELP to welcome back someone who really needs no introduction, the former HELP director and socio-emotional learning champion, Kim Schonert-Reichl, and her socio-emotional learning research team for this very exciting two-part webinar series. Today's webinar will be moderated by Maureen Dockendorf, likely known to many of you. Maureen Dockendorf has spent her career in public education. She's worked as a teacher, a university faculty associate, principal, and assistant superintendent. As the superintendent of reading, literacy, and early learning at the BC Ministry of Education, Maureen has been a team member supporting the redesign of BC's 2019 Early Learning Framework, K-12 curriculum and core competencies. Maureen currently works with the BC Ministry of Education and Childcare as the Learning Strategic Consultant. Passionate about improving life chances for all children and families, her work supports joint professional learning for educators in the earlier sector and primary teachers with focus on social and emotional learning. With that, I will hand over the talking stick to Maureen and look forward to listening in.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. You know, how exciting for all of us to be here and be able to spend an hour and a half with one of our key researchers and leaders, not only in BC, not only in Canada, throughout North America, and also internationally, Dr. Kim Schonert-Reichl. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kim, who is currently the NoVo Foundation Endowed Chair in Social and Emotional Learning at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Now, don't worry, she's moved out of British Columbia, but she keeps in close contact with us and continues to be our friendly critic and our critical friend to ensure we continue to be on the path of implementation around social and emotional learning. Our second presenter today will also be really well known to you, and I have had the absolute pleasure of presenting many sessions around well-being with Dr. Molly Lawlor, who is not only a consultant for social and emotional learning, the principal scientific advisor for MindUP, which has been at the heart of many of our school districts for a very long time. Molly is that key lead person. And I can only tell you her depth and breadth around social and emotional learning and effective programs and practice is absolutely outstanding. So we're so lucky. And for those of you who are really familiar with Molly and Kim, you know they're not only colleagues, but they're very good friends, and they work closely together. The other person we have today, Denise, you're going to give a wave, and Kim is going to introduce you. But please, you know, see Denise, who is foundational to the work as well. And Denise will be actually monitoring the Q&A. So any questions you have, we welcome you to put them in that Q&A. And Denise, you're not going to see her through the whole session, but we wanted to make sure you had the visual. So how fortunate for us today. And with deep thanks to HELP as well, who has been our friend and a real leader in much of the work around the EDI and the MDI, and we're so grateful to be working with HELP today as well. Just before Kim begins the session, I also just really want to raise the importance of where we are in this world, living and working and learning in British Columbia, because not all ministries of education are as blessed, well, to be working with us for one thing, but not all ministries of education across North America have embraced social and emotional learning to the degree British Columbia has. And so we are continually grateful that we work with a government who understands the importance of social and emotional learning as just inherent in curriculum. And you can see that in the revised curriculum. You can see that in the competencies. And I'm going to highlight social responsibility, personal responsibility. And I have to say, one of my faves, positive personal and cultural identity. The work and the connections to be thinking about the development of the whole child. And although literacy and numeracy we know matter to literate citizens, our government has really embraced the research and the science that says we need to be working to be developing holistically our beautiful children and youth. And social and emotional learning is absolutely foundational. And as Kim says all the time, how they feel affects how they learn. So I really want to start this off with our context in British Columbia, the connections to the First Peoples principles of learning, our compassionate systems leadership, so leading with compassion. So we are very fortunate to be in this culture. And Kim, I'll take you back to the social responsibility standards that we worked with and developed in the mid-90s. So we've been embraced in the science and the research, thanks to your leadership, thanks to your tenacity, thanks to your wisdom. And we are just blessed that we have you as a person, our rock star, Kim, around social emotional learning. So please, Kim, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Maureen. It's been such a pleasure over many, I want to say at least a couple of decades working so closely with you, and really so wonderful to be back here. I'm going to say I'm back here in British Columbia right now, even though I'm in Chicago, my heart is still very much strongly in British Columbia. So I'm going to start. So, one thing, I'll just give you a bit of background. So we decided to do this webinar is really on giving you the latest update on the current state of social and emotional learning. What do we know? What do we need to know? And how does it fit within the context of British Columbia and Canada? And so that's hence our motivation for doing this, to give you really an update. So I'm going to share my screen here and start. And just to remind you that, in fact, this whole webinar is being recorded, and we are able to record that. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out, I have to see how to share my slideshow. Sorry, everyone. I'm just these technology things we have to deal with. Let me just do slideshow. I'm just seeing, sorry, I'm just having a hard time figuring out what the stuff is on the bottom to actually show in my PowerPoint. Let me just see. Bottom, no, it doesn't work. Denise is texting me saying the bottom is not there. The bottom has disappeared somehow. So I'm not able to see how to do it. Slideshow, sorry, everyone, slideshow, play from start. Here we go. Okay. Yay, did it work? Yes, yay. Okay, sorry about that. Those little glitches always happen. I think we're getting more used to them in the last 3 years. So again, such a pleasure to be here with you. We really have my dream team here with us today. Of course, Molly, who I've worked with for a long time, Dr. Molly Lawlor, who has been doing lots of work in this area for many years. Maureen, who has been the champion of SEL and really has been a huge cheerleader, and really such an instigator. I'm going to call you an instigator, Maureen, instigator of lots of things. And then we have Dr. Denise Biot, who is actually going to be supporting us on this question and answer part. So without further, and just to give you a bit of a context, Molly and I are going to go back and forth. I'm going to present some information. She's going to present other stuff. And we're really looking forward to your questions that you have. And so please, as we're presenting, please write in any questions you have, so for us to do that. So the title of this presentation is the state of social and emotional learning. What do we know and where do we go from here? We have 6 different topics we're going to cover. I know it's a lot. We'll see how, I want to say, hang on tight for what we're going to be sharing you. We're going to start first just to have a level playing field about what is social and emotional learning. So everyone has the definition. Why now? What are some advances in the field of social and emotional learning? What are some advances in the science? And what are some of the next steps? And then, of course, we'll have a moderated discussion. So what is social and emotional learning? There's lots of different frameworks. We're really drawing from this one you see on the left, which is from CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning, that has identified social and emotional learning as using these 5 different dimensions of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And typically, social and emotional learning is defined as the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage their emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show compassion and empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. And as you see in the graphic, these happen in the context of communities, in families, schools, and classrooms, and happen also are supported through things like different kinds of learning, authentic partnerships, learning opportunities, that all those things. So really think of that as this systemic approach to social and emotional learning. It doesn't happen just in the individual, but it's part of a larger system. And we'll get to that more later. And why now do we need to be thinking about that? And I won't go into detail, really, because I think so many of you know what we've just been through with COVID, with world events unfolding. But we do know, I'm just going to give you a couple of pieces of data, and there's so much more on this, really drawing from data both in North America and in Canada. And what we know is, in a recent survey with the Center for Disease Control, 44% of high school students reported feeling sad or hopeless in the past year. 71% of parents said the pandemic had taken a toll on their children's mental health. Of teachers, now this is a really important one to think about. The Gallup poll, which is done every few years, asked which was the most stressful profession, and found that teachers were the highest among all professions, even above nurses, above doctors, with 52% reporting extensive burnout. And then the study done just right here in British Columbia with Anna Gatterman and colleagues, including myself, in a report of K-12 teachers, of this survey of K-12 teachers, reported that they were now more likely to leave the profession than before the pandemic, which is really concerning if we think about our workforce in educators. But how are the children in BC? Well, something that's very unique, and again, really emphasized at the Human Early Learning Partnership, or HELP, is that when you ask the question, how are the children? Very few jurisdictions in the entire world can actually have data to answer that question. But HELP is one of those, because HELP has been collecting data from the Early Development Instrument and the Middle Years Development Instrument for years. So so we just celebrated 20 years of data collection from the Early Development Instrument, and that was reported. Just to remind anyone who doesn't know, that the EDI has 5 dimensions, including well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, communication skills, and general knowledge. And what we know is we can really look at these different dimensions on kindergarten children across the province. So we've been collecting these data since about 2001. So it's just 20 years. And this Wave 8 data collection was done. It's collected across multiple time points, because to get enough data for the whole 3 years, it's every 3 years. Some districts are just once during that 3 years, some districts a couple times. So for year 1, it was February 2020, February 2021 for year 2, and February 2022 for year 3, with an 88% participation rate. So it's population level data on child well-being. So the overall vulnerability in British Columbia has been rising across the years since 2004. as you see, from 29.9% of children vulnerable across the province to 32.9% in this latest wave 8. But what's really concerning and really relevant to this conversation is the increase in the social competence and emotional maturity in terms of vulnerability. And what you see here of the 5 dimensions, really of the 5 dimensions that the EDI measures, that those 2 dimensions have had the greatest increase in vulnerability across the waves. And this is really concerning for us. And we know that these vulnerabilities in social emotional function in kindergarten actually predict increased odds of mental health conditions by age 14 and really show different patterns of progression for internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And then we have the middle years development instrument, which has been around since 2010 in the province. It's a measure of children's 4th to 8th grade now, children's well-being during the middle years. And it's a self-report measure that's linked to health and well-being and success and social emotional development, both inside and outside the school. There's 5 dimensions also on the MDI that measure a number of different constructs, including social and emotional development, connectedness, physical health and well-being, after school time and school experiences as well. And there's a measure of an index of well-being of how children score. And in terms of looking at vulnerability, the MDI really has a focus on thriving. It's a strengths-based measure. Look at the greatest number of children thriving from the well-being index on those 5 dimensions of optimism, self-esteem, happiness, absence of sadness, and general health. So what we have is we've been able to look at with the pandemic is this idea of looking over time in terms of the changes in children across the different grade levels. So as I said, now the MDI goes grade 4 to 8. And here you can see in terms of the percent of children thriving from 2019, 2020, 2021 to 2022. And you'll see a sort of downward staircase that you see the grade 4s, not as great. Grade 5s increasing a bit more, but look at those grade 7s and then the grade 8s, where they've had the steepest decline in well-being, both from prior to the pandemic to this past year. And you see both of those, the grade 4 wasn't significant, but then you start looking across those 5 dimensions and see across general health, happiness, absence of sadness, optimism, and self-esteem, you see some of the greatest declines around things like happiness, as well as optimism and self-esteem, absence of sadness. So they've all been going down since pre-pandemic till now. And what we know that it isn't just the student's own stress and well-being affects, of course, their school success, but the teacher's own well-being also is connected to students' well-being. In a study we did with one of my colleagues who's at HELP, Ava Oberl, looking at stress contagion in the classroom, we looked at teacher stress and burnout, and then linked it to students' cortisol level. So yes, we wanted to look at how students were feeling stressed, but we wanted to look at it physiologically. So we collected their cortisol, which is a stress hormone that actually tells you about stress in the system. And yes, to collect cortisol, you collect saliva. And these were with 4th to 7th grade children who loved giving us their saliva. I wonder how it would be now post-COVID. That would be kind of interesting. But we really looked at the results, which were so fascinating, was that higher levels of teacher stress and burnout were associated with higher levels of student stress as measured through cortisol. And so what it says now is if we're really looking at, we mentioned teachers before, if we really want to look at how the kids are doing, we have to always consider how the educators are doing, and that any attempt to actually help to improve the well-being of students has to hand in hand talk about the well-being of the adults as well. And we'll talk about that a bit more as well. So we know, for instance, that if we care about the well-being of our students, we must work together to support their social and emotional well-being, particularly now. And we really need to
what we know is from the science that SEL is a key ingredient in addressing these top concerns for schools right now: mental wellness, academic recovery. I want to mention something else, and maybe someone has a question about this later, is it isn't just about academic recovery, it's social and emotional recovery. How I've heard so many stories of people, teacher, educators telling me students now just seem less mature. They've lost that. They have this gap in their socialization experiences. And we also know that social emotional learning has never been more important, and our students' well-being and futures rest on what we do in this moment. And these are in the words of Dr. Aaliyah Samuel, who's the president and CEO of CASEL. So here's some advances in the field of SEL. I'm going to kind of give you, here's some things if you want to know, like what's new in social and emotional learning. One thing that's really happening now is, for so many years, there was such a talk about SEL programs. Doing SEL was, oh, we have this program, we have Second Step, we have MindUP, we have that, and we're doing everything about SEL. But we know now from the research, and actually how the field has changed, is that really you need a systemic approach to social and emotional learning to create equitable learning conditions that actively involve all pre-K to grade 12 students in learning and practicing social and emotional and academic competencies. So if you really think about it, this is an infographic created at Help by Ada, one of our designers, that when you think about social and emotional learning, you should always think of it along these three dimensions. It includes, of course, the promoting the SEL of the students, but also the SEL of the educators and the learning context. That includes things like the school climate, how does discipline approaches, how you assess things, community connections, family school partnerships. All of those actually are part of social and emotional learning. So if you look at these different 5 dimensions, it includes the district or jurisdiction, the administrators, the school leaders, the support system. It includes the student, which includes youth voice and engagement, and our students provided with opportunities to participate. The building, a focus on promoting the adult SEL, the positive relationships and the supportive and caring context. The community, that includes authentic family partnerships and aligned community partnerships, and of course, evidence-based SEL programs. So you still include the evidence-based SEL programs, again, really important, but also SEL is integrated in academics. And what we've learned, to me, this is what I've heard over and over again during the pandemic, is that social and emotional learning is not one more thing on the plate, it is the plate. It's really important. And then we have another aspect of social and emotional learning that has really grown in recent years, is really a focus on transformational SEL, which is a lever for equity. So it's closely connected to social and emotional learning, but it really elevates the focus on equity and identity. So actually, Maureen, it was so great earlier, you pointed out this personal identity, the idea of personal identity is a positive personal identity is an important part of the competencies. This is really where transformational SEL fits in, because it focuses on identity as well as belonging. And in order for SEL to adequately serve those from underserved communities and promote the optimal development of all of our children and youth, and the adults, it must cultivate in them the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action to address root causes of inequity. And this is really, again, something new that has been elevated in the field of SEL, that real focus on really calling out those inequities and really working together to find ways to do those. So I'm going to hand it over to Molly now. And Molly, I think I can't here. Let me see. We'll have to figure out a way that I can see you to, there we go. Okay. Take it away.
Thank you. So first, I just want to say I'm really, really excited to be here. I am with some of my favorite people, as you probably got a sense of from Maureen's introduction. I've been working with Kim for 20 years, maybe. And Maureen, I've had the privilege and joy to work with over the last number of years as well. And it's wonderful to be together. And Denise too. Denise and I have a long history being lab mates in Kim's lab. So here we are all together. So I'm going to just begin by really acknowledging the work that has been happening, prior to this SEL language, or social emotional learning, which has been around for 30 years. But it's important to acknowledge that, looking at the education of the whole child has actually been happening in many cultures for generations. And so I love this framework, the First Nations perspective on health and wellness, where you can see the, emotions and mental and spiritual and physical domains of development are given equal standing, and they're supported by relationships really around the child. So those relationships, responsibility, wisdom, respect for others are always in that context of family, land, and community. We can go to the next slide, Kim. And here in BC, I think, we're really fortunate to hold this up and bring it together with the First Nations perspectives that guide the First Peoples Principles of Learning, which is an approach to education that emphasizes the inner qualities of the child, as well as their relationships to the community and the land, which I think is so beautiful and timely, especially in our world today, and deepens some of the sort of thinking, I think, from the Castle framework around connections to community and the land. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So just taking a closer look at the first three principles, I wanted to highlight those today, just to kind of zoom in on kind of how these are integrated in this framework and have been integrated in the province of British Columbia by the ministry. I think is a fabulous way to deepen the work of social emotional learning and bring in the voice of First Nations and learn from it. So the first point, learning ultimately supports the well-being of the self, the family, the community, the land, the spirits, and the ancestors. So really bringing in that holistic perspective. And then honoring the reflective and experiential and relational aspects of learning in the second point. And then thirdly, the learning involves recognizing the consequences of one's actions. So thinking of that kind of direct link back to the Castle framework around responsible decision-making. This all really connects and aligns very well with what's happening in the province of BC. So we can go to the next slide. And here we have a neat kind of image. Kim, you can jump in if you want, but here a map of the world that highlights where we see SEL and its growth. And so it's amazing to see it represented across every continent, whether it be implementation of SEL programs in the green dots, or that SEL has actually been implemented in policy. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit more, looking deeply at British Columbia, but you can see it's happening. Alaska is a really great example, and then places in the US, Kim, certainly in Illinois now, there's a lot happening there, and that's the mothership of Castle resides in Illinois. So there's a lot of things happening in policy, which is really encouraging. Next slide. So now zooming into British Columbia, I'm just highlighting a couple of things from the Ministry of Education and Childcare. The first being the mental health and school strategy, which many of you will be familiar with. And I was fortunate to work on that document alongside with Kim and Denise, which really brought forward the importance of mental well-being as a central component of education. And so the mental health strategy and school strategy there, you can see some of the pillars that the ministry has identified as critical to their approach. Here you can see the compassionate systems leadership, which really addresses the importance of leaders in setting the tone and supporting them in the work that they do. Capacity building, and then of course mental health in the classroom, which is really a lot of what our focus is on today, but a few things that are exciting happening with the ministry. So we can go to the next slide. And Maureen at the beginning chatted about these social responsibility sort of responsibility performance standards, which came out in the mid-90s. And here we have two individuals on the presentation, Kim and Maureen, who I feel like were really the research and the practice coming together at that time, helping move this work forward. And so these were put forth and as a optional thing for districts to use, and they became wildly popular. And I think that was part of the reason why it set it planted the seed, I think, for a lot of the work that happened following those performance standards. And we can dig into that more in the moderated discussion.
Yeah, and
So, go Kim.
Well, because when you started working with me, we were working on looking at finding ways to evaluate social responsibility in schools, like in 2004. Anyway, so just want to say it's all amazing how this all comes full circle.
It does, yeah. And then here we have our wonderful BC core competencies, which Maureen mentioned at the top of the call of the presentation. And I just wanted to kind of make those connections, because I think sometimes there's a lot of language, terminology, frameworks. How do they work together? Are we talking about the same things? So I did a little, mental activity to show you how our core competencies in BC being communication, thinking, both creative and critical, and our personal and social responsibility competency, how do those map onto our CASEL framework here? And so if you go to the next slide, so generally it's all interwoven. So these things are all important. So for example, if you think about, communication, you might assume that, the personal and social responsibility, well, that's the SEL one, right? That's the SEL competency. But I would argue that they're all interwoven and that you need to have, and the core competencies themselves are interwoven, but I would say, the CASEL 5 competencies are really vital for all of these things. So take communication. It's really challenging to become an effective communicator if you have trouble recognizing and managing your emotions. I think we've all had conversations with someone in our lives when they're not well regulated, and it doesn't usually, go very well. So these things are all working together. And so now I want to take a closer look at the personal and social competency. So here we have, and I just also want to highlight, how fortunate we are in British Columbia to have these core competencies. This is really how social emotional learning is woven into the curriculum. It's not that extra thing anymore. It's actually in our curriculum, which is so exciting. And I think, the work that happened around these competencies, it really extended and deepened social emotional learning. So here you have, and we don't have time today to go into great detail, but I just want to show you how comprehensive this is, where you have these three facets of this competency. You have personal awareness and responsibility, which involves self-advocating, self-regulating, and well-being. Then you have your second facet, which is positive personal and cultural identity. So being able to understand relationships and cultural contexts, recognizing personal values and choices, and identifying personal strengths and abilities. And then social awareness and responsibility. So valuing diversity, resolving problems, building relationships, and collaborating with community and caring for the environment. So all of those three facets have six different profiles. So I'm not going to go into all of those today, but I just really want to highlight how deep this work is and how thoughtful this was put forward. So if we go to the next slide, just as an example to see, how do these fit together when we say, is it either or, the CASEL framework or our competencies? It's really both. And how do they work together? So when we think about personal awareness and responsibility, that particular competency is really tapping into our self-awareness, our self-management, which means, being able to regulate our emotions, and also responsible decision-making. Positive personal cultural identity, you're using your self-awareness, your social awareness, responsible decision-making. And then of course, our social awareness is tapping into our to that very construct of CASEL and relationship skills and responsible decision making. So just a little illustration on how these things are really well aligned and integrated. And so I put together a little fun SEL FAQs. So things that I hear in my work of just kind of wonderings, what about SEL? So let's go with our first one here. So is SEL the same as mental health? Well, before we answer that one, let's get into kind of what do we mean by mental health? And I love the quote from the Public Health Agency of Canada, and I know Kim says this often, is, positive mental health is more than the absence of mental illness. And so a couple of definitions here for you is to consider is, from the Public Health Agency of Canada's, mental health is the capacity of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with challenges we face. It is the positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. I think that's fantastic. And I just wanted to kind of frame our conversation and what we mean by mental health. And then I won't go through the WHO, but you can read that as well. And it's really about thriving. It's about well-being, flourishing, supporting ourselves to quote Oprah, live our best life. We can go to the next slide. So, but what about SEL and mental health? So first of all, they're not the same, but I'd say, and again, I'll point out the casel.org website has a great resources on this to unpack more. We're just doing a light touch, but to quickly answer that question, they're not the same. However, SEL is an important contributor to mental health. We know that children who have better social emotional competencies are doing better generally in their well-being and their mental health. So it's really vital to focus on these things because it is a protective factor. So and SEL skills are malleable. So it's a really powerful tool that we can use to support our children and youth in warding off potential problems down the road by giving them healthy ways to regulate emotions, being aware of their emotions. Again, calling to the BC mental health strategy, mental health literacy, and trauma-informed practices. All of these things work together to build up those protective factors. And again, just highlighting, many of us are familiar with the multi-tiered system. Sorry, Kim. Go for it. We're good. Go for it. We're good. Multi-tiered systems of support. So where does SEL fit into that? Generally, SEL is seen as that tier 1 universal approach. So we want all children to get SEL. We want them, that is where we have everybody, we're catching everybody. And I often say this is really critical because a lot of students who are experiencing, internalizing type issues, anxiety, depressions, a lot of times they go under the radar. So SEL can help provide that early intervention around developing healthy self-regulation and emotion management skills. And then, of course, students who require more support will be identified and move up into tier 2. However, SEL can still be supportive there and still into tier 3, where you have more intensive intervention for kids who need even more support. I will say also SEL, as far as the context, the learning environment, when we have all children receiving social emotional learning, it's not just about developing skills that help the individual. It's about developing skills that help the community. So if you focus on SEL in the tier 1 and every child is receiving this, they're developing their capacity for empathy and compassion. So if they have kids in their classrooms who perhaps have disruptive behavior and need more intensive supports, they can respond with patience and tolerance and compassion. So I think it's really vital that we think about these things across all 3 tiers. And we can move to the next one. And again, this comes from the Castle School Guide. So if for those of you that are interested in learning more about, the integration of SEL into the multi-tiered support, this is a great resource. But generally, we want to position evidence-based SEL programming. So Kim will probably chat about that a little later, and practices in that tier 1. And then tier 2 and 3, we want those to really align with our SEL goals. So we don't want to be doing something in tier 3 that is giving a mixed message to all those tier 1 interventions or strategies. And then again, integrating those practices. So relationship building, relationship is so vital for all learning. And then reinforcing those core competencies across all 3 tiers is really critical. Okay. So second question, is SEL trauma informed? Yes, if it's done well. If it's done well, then yes, it's trauma informed. And bringing back Kim mentioned in systemic SEL, the importance of context, adults and students. And so I'm just going to quickly go through those 3 pieces from a trauma informed lens. So if we go to the next slide. So briefly, again, this is a quick pass, but trauma-informed practice is really grounded in providing children and youth with safe environments. And central to SEL is the understanding that the context is critical. You need to foster an inclusive, safe, and caring learning environment. So these things work very well together. And we know from research that kids who feel like they belong in those safe, inclusive, caring classrooms are more engaged, they have better academic outcomes, and they have higher well-being. So next slide. And now speaking to the adults, and I know Kim and I are very passionate about this, and Maureen too. This is so vital. So it's so important for an adult educator to be able to approach their class with a trauma-informed lens. They need to have those SEL skills that are necessary to create that safe and inclusive environment, to recognize emotions in others, regulate their own emotions, to respond with empathy and compassion. A lot of times children who've experienced trauma, it comes out in their behavior, which can be very challenging. And so for an educator to be able to approach that, regulate perhaps they're feeling stressed themselves and frustrated perhaps, be able to regulate that in order to respond to that child with empathy and compassion. And also to be able to model the skills necessary. So a lot of this for both trauma-informed practice and SEL is to be able to model healthy coping strategies to build resilience. Okay, and then SEL for students. So the student skills are vital as well. So trauma, we know, negatively impacts kids' SEL competencies, in particular, emotion awareness and emotion regulation. And so by helping students develop those skills, which we know are malleable, you can help them to recognize those sensations that are happening in their body, perhaps related to trauma, and connect those to feelings, and to help them to name those feelings and express them safely. As Dr. Dan Siegel says, name it to tame it. And again, as I mentioned before, SEL helps to build those protective factors to manage adversity. And a big part of that is building healthy support networks, which all comes back around to the context and the adults who make it possible to have those healthy relationships. Okay, so our last FAQ, is SEL just a program? So I've heard this one a lot, and Kim chatted about this before. So I'll just quickly say 2 things. So I would say SEL is both a program and practices. So I think the programs are really, really helpful, provided they're evidence-based and well-designed, to provide sequenced skill building. So if you want to be teaching children self-regulation strategies, there are programs can help you do that in a developmentally appropriate sequenced way. And I just highlight this SAFE acronym from Castle, which talks about well-designed programs are sequenced, they're active, they're focused, and they're explicit. And then SEL practices, which Kim chatted quickly about, which are these instructional strategies that promote SEL skills and provide those opportunities for practice. And so this gives us the opportunity to weave it in throughout the school day. So, SEL isn't a program you do on Tuesdays from 9 to 10 a.m. It's happening in everything you do. And I know I wish I could give the mic to Maureen right now, because Maureen, this is words that you live by. But this is how you weave it into everything you do. It's how the educator embodies it. It's how the kids have opportunities throughout the day to practice. And so I'm going to hand it back to Kim to talk about the science.
Well, it'd be great. And I feel that, here, I feel like, we've given a lot of the background, a lot of the information. Molly, thank you so much. I think those FAQs are so important, but I want to just give an example. And some people might have heard me give this example because I want to sort of bring this to life of what it means when you're actually embedding it. And so, some of you have heard this, but maybe not. Some of you haven't. So Griffin, who is my oldest son, who's 26 now. Oh my God, he's my baby's growing up. I don't know if anybody else experiences that, but anyway, when he was 3.5, he was at this wonderful preschool. Amazing preschool. And I didn't know at the time that they were really using SEL they were just amazing early childhood educators a big shout out to all early childhood educators, just have to say that. And I came to pick up Griffin, and the teacher took me aside and said, there was a bit of an incident today with Griffin. And of course I'm like, oh, and she said, well, Griffin had a bit of a tussle with a friend. They were both playing with Lego. Griffin wanted the Lego. The friend wouldn't give him the Lego. Griffin scratched the friend's cheek. And so, of course, I, studying empathy, thought, oh no, my child has no empathy. And second of all, anybody who has little ones know that you have to keep their nails clipped quite often. And you know how fast they grow. So I was like, I haven't been cutting his nails enough. And so then I'm like, oh, well, what should I do? I was kind of, rattled a bit. And I was like, what should I do? And the early childhood educator, the teacher, told me, oh, no, we worked it out. Don't worry about it. And I said, well, what did you do? And she said, oh, we just use it as an opportunity. So to help develop social and emotional skills. And I'm like, oh, and I said, so what happened? She goes, well, we first, made sure the little boy who was crying a bit with his face scratched, that he was okay. And then we went to Griffin and we asked Griffin, like, how do you think your friend is feeling right now? And Griffin, what a feeling is first, name it, what feeling is your friend feeling? And then next, why do you think your friend is feeling that way? And then they got together, and this is the next step they did. Again, this is like the practice of SEL in life with the teachers who, didn't just send Griffin off to the corner, whatever, and give the other child all the Lego. They said, instead, let's think of some ways in which, Griffin, you could help your friend feel better. So like two boys conversed and came up with the idea of a cold washcloth on his friend's face where the scratch had happened. And the teacher took Griffin over to the sink, got a fluffy washcloth, got it under the water, so it was just the right temperature, wrung it out, and then put two little chairs facing each other with enough room so that Griffin could lean over and hold the washcloth on his friend's face. And what's amazing there is it was SEL in action. It was using that opportunity of integrating social and emotional learning, teaching emotions, teaching conflict resolution, teaching empathy, teaching compassion in the context of a teacher who had those skills to be able to model them, to facilitate that all at once. And so I just want to, what Molly's been talking about, this idea of the practices and integrating that, of how important that is. So now I'm just going to briefly give you, very brief, some of you out there might be going, yes, I love SEL, but I come back and I have people who tell me, why SEL? Why should we be spending our time on this? Isn't it just academics that's going to lead to success? And so I'm going to give you some of my favorite outcome research. So one is that, first of all, we know social and emotional skills predict important adult outcomes. There's research showing that social emotional skills in kindergarten are a better predictor of life success than academic achievement. So one study found that those students followed from the age 5 till 25, 27, found that those kids with high pro-social skills, or those with high social and emotional skills, were more likely to graduate from high school find stable employment, attend post-secondary. So a whole host of positive outcomes and life success, whereas kids who had lower pro-social skills were not able to. We also know that these are malleable. We know from neuroplasticity, from the brain, that you can teach skills like empathy and compassion and self-regulation. The brain is malleable and is plastic, and there are certain developmental periods in which there's more opportunity for these brain changes to happen. We also know that social emotional skills rival IQ in predicting life success. In fact, there was a wonderful report, this one from 2014, that showed it was a better predictor than IQ in many outcomes. And we also know that SEL programs are also associated with better health outcomes, that those people who are better able to manage their emotions or able to even help and show gratitude actually live longer, have better cardiovascular health. We also know that SEL programs, when you look specifically at programs, and this was an important part early on in the field, that they promote pro-sociality like kindness, well-being, and improve academic achievement. And one of the biggest studies on this, that's 2011, so it's getting a bit dated, and they're redoing a whole new meta-analysis of this, just so you know, found when you looked at all the SEL programs with over almost 270,000 students, a number of over 200 studies, and they compared the kids, outcomes in terms of kids who had SEL programs or those who did not, found that those kids who were in SEL programs not only improved in their positive social behaviors, they had fewer conduct problems, less emotional distress, and improved grades and test scores. And in fact, the kids in SEL programs had an 11 percentile increase in their academic achievement compared to kids who didn't have an SEL program. So any argument that says we can't take time away from academics is really disproven with this large meta-analysis. We also know that 80 teachers and parents agree with SEL, that 84% of teachers said integrating SEL into the core curriculum has become even more important since the start of the pandemic. And parents, 88% of parents said they want their children to learn social and emotional skills like respect, cooperation, perseverance, and empathy. So what are some next steps moving forward? I really want to say we need to kind of grow educating the heart and make it an integral and necessary and essential part of education. And we need things like, and I have to say, this is like my wish list of what we need for the science to improve the practice. Number one, I think we need research practice partnerships or practice research partnerships where practitioners work in collaboration with researchers to answer some important questions that are emerged from practice. We need a focus, and this is interesting, in SEL, it's just relatively new where compassion-based approaches are coming into, where things that focus specifically on compassion. I know, of course, we have roots of empathy in Canada, but it's really relatively rare. We need integration of contemplative approaches like mindfulness into SEL programs. We need evaluations of SEL programs at a whole systems level, not just a program in the school, but looking at all aspects of a system. We need to really focus on implementation and adaptability of SEL programs, as well as look at mixed methods, studies that include both quantitative and qualitative findings. And we need a focus on teachers. And I just say, I'm looping back full circle. We need to really, I really believe that to really help the students, we have to support the teachers. That's really, anyways, I could go on and on about that, and answer questions like, how does teachers' own social emotional competence and well-being influence their implementation of programs? Are there any benefits for teachers who are actually implementing SEL programs for themselves when they implement an SEL program for their students? And what are teachers' experiences learning from them? So we really need research that includes the voices of children as well. And so I'm saying some of this because I will be telling you about our next webinar that really highlights these two aspects of the educators and the voices of the students. And then just to end this, just one big advance in the field is the launch of the first ever Journal of Social and Emotional Learning. And it's called Social and Emotional Learning, Research, Practice, and Policy. And it's the new authoritative quarterly online publication. It's just now the first issue is being assembled. And just so you know, it is an open access journal. So all of the articles will be accessible. And it's really a mixture of articles that are both for empirical research perspectives on sort of issues in the field, and then for practice and policy. There's a link there. So just to begin to end here, and looking forward to your questions, I want to loop back to the Dalai Lama, and he's really been my inspiration for many years. I think, I'm not sure if you know, in BC, it's really a special place for him. He's come several times to visit. You know, they started the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education that was instigated by his visits. And he really is at the heart of his work, what he wants his legacy to be is this education of the heart. So he says it is vital that when educating our children's brains, that we do not neglect to educate their hearts, a key element of which has to be the nurturing of our compassionate nature. So I'm going to end here. Thank you. Just to tell you ahead of time, we are going to have the next session on January 26th. Will be a follow-up to this webinar, and it's going to be called Implementing a Mindfulness-Based SEL Program with Early Adolescents, Lessons from the Field. We're going to be sharing some results from a recent study we did of the MindUP middle school program, along with some relevance for other SEL programs, focusing specifically on the implementation and feasibility with the voices of teachers and students, and be talking about those. And I'm going to be joined by Dr. Jenna Whitehead, who's at HELP, as well as Dr. Rebecca Balin. And we have the fortune to have Danielle Carter Sullivan, who's the executive director in the BC Ministry of Education and Childcare, as our moderator. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and looking forward to our conversation here. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, thank you so much, Kim and Molly. As always, there's not a time I spend with you that I don't learn something. So thank you so much. And you know, one question I think that will emerge is, are the slides going to be available to participants? And Kim, I know you and Molly, you are both always so generous about sharing the slide deck. So Denise, maybe you could confirm whether this would be on the HELP website where people could actually access these.
Yes, they will be put up on the HELP website. So absolutely, people will be able to view them after the event.
They'll be able to see the recording, but also the slides. If we could keep, I think people are asking maybe just for the slides. And
yeah, the PowerPoint, because it really helps people to be able to utilize those in the presentations they're doing. So, so for folks that are still with us and are able to spend the next half hour, I'm going to ask Molly and Kim a couple of questions. Feel free to put any questions you may have in the Q&A. And I just want to reinforce, there has never been a more important time that we need to focus on social and emotional learning. And I'm so heartened. I looked at the list of participants, Kim and Molly. I know there's a new position in British Columbia that you'll be familiar with, the District Early Learning and Childcare Leads. And there are so many of these folks on the call. And I just really want to give a shout out to them for carving out the time to be here today. And just to reinforce a couple of things, because often I hear, well, I don't have time to spend on social and emotional learning. And for those of you who know me, I just say directly back, actually, you don't have time not to. It's kind of like spending time outdoors. You don't have time not to. And to be really reinforcing, and Kim and Molly, you've both taught me this, to be thinking about social emotional learning as the same way you think about fitness. Or the same way you think about reading or numeracy, that it's about practice. And so these skills are malleable, as you've said. They do need to be taught. And, you know, it's why it's so important for us to have a multiplicity of strategies, because if this one didn't work, we need another one. If this one didn't work, we need another one. And I'm also just a huge, I really, Molly and Kim, I want you to know, I try to start this movement called the slow teaching movement. And for us, and for those of you in these district lead positions, if you're hearing, well, we have to teach the curriculum. You heard Kim, this is the plate. This is the curriculum. And what weaving that into the fabric of everything we do in daily practice. One of my favorite opportunities in my life was to open up a school with a focus on social and emotional well-being. And we had all these questions. We were trying to figure out what would that look like. I learned so much about children. We underestimate their competencies. They could learn anything. They actually never posed a barrier. It was the adults that posed the barrier. Well, we don't have time. You're taking 3 minutes away from this. Actually, just slowing down, being present in that moment, really focusing on relationships, which, as Dr. Jean would tell us, are the nutrient of the brain, is critically important. Slowing down, taking the time, and doing what we know is right to develop holistically these beautiful children and youth that we're so blessed to work with. So just reinforcing for those of you in those district positions to just really reinforce, yes, that's what this BC curriculum is about. It's inherent, it's built in, it's woven in, and it is really a moral and ethical responsibility that we're paying attention to social and emotional learning. We have these amazing researchers who continue to bring us new science, who continue to invest in British Columbia, and a government that has framed so many possibilities for that. And I also want to say, Kim, you gave a shout out to the early childhood educators. The development of those performance standards involved early childhood educators. And if you think about the renaming of the Ministry of Education and Childcare, we have to also shift our mindset to not be thinking about K-12, but rather to be thinking about birth to post-secondary, and be thinking about the importance of the early childhood educators in our system. So all of that, who have been teaching social and emotional well-being since they began those roles. So just thinking about the shifts in our system, I think, is critically important. So Molly and Kim, I know a lot of people are really curious. What are you hearing about children's and youth's post-COVID social and emotional development? And you may even want to pull in adults as well, because it's been a really difficult 3 years. So can you tell us what you're hearing? Any research that you're working on? We'd be really curious about that.
I can start just because I have an article I want to share. Kim, you'll be excited, a new article. But I've been hearing, I have 2 kids, middle school and high school, and certainly so I've, had a front row seat to their experience in COVID, and also their educators. And so, anecdotally, I'm hearing that kids are coming in with delayed social and emotional skills. They're not where they were pre-pandemic. So I think it's vital that we all recognize that and understand that, what was typical for, say, a grade 7 in, 2018 is not typical now. So that's anecdotally, but I just want to mention one study that I came across yesterday, a recent study, and I'll just mention it, that looked at teenagers' brain development pre-pandemic versus post. And here is the kind of the first, hard data that I've kind of seen examining this around brain maturation, and finding that, so compared to teenagers before the pandemic, those who have gone through they just looked actually at the 10 months of lockdown. So it was a study in 2020, showed 3 to 4 years of premature aging in those teen brains, specifically in the amygdala, which is involved in our stress response, the hippocampus, involved in learning and memory, and the cerebral cortex, which includes, our thinking part of our brain. So I just want to put that out there as some, I haven't had a moment to really kind of unpack that, but that's a fascinating finding, and kind of backs up some of the anecdotal pieces that we're hearing from the field. So I'll turn to Kim now.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like a great article. I can't wait to get it. Please.
I will send it to you.
Now I'll read it on my way home.
Kim won't be driving, don't worry.
Molly, maybe you could put it in the chat, could you?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Please.
I'll do
Great.
that.
That'd be great. I think there's a couple of things. One thing is, we talk about, so first of all, just coming from the field, and I have to say, but I love working so closely with educators across British Columbia, is that I learn so much from them. I learn so much and really listen to them so much. And they've been, it's inspired so much of my research. But one thing I've heard over and over again this past year, as well as last year, is that students are coming into the classroom with less maturity. They seem to be less mature. They seem to be like exactly what Molly was saying. A grade 7 student shows up in my room. I've had grade 7 students before that, but this past 2 years, they show up and they're acting like a younger child. They're acting younger. They don't have the same competencies. And as a developmental psychologist, I can tell you what happened is that what we know for children's development, they need peer socialization experiences. Of course, they need those ideas because we learn from each other, especially during those elementary and middle school and high school years. So much of your learning is not just with your parents at home or not just with the one-on-one with the teacher. It's in those socialization experiences. And so we didn't have just a learning loss. We had a social emotional loss. We had a loss of those socialization experiences. So if you have to think, it really is a developmental delay of those children who went through that time period of having isolation, having learning, and they didn't get the same experiences. So when we see their maturity and see that they're not, why are they acting that way? That's one thing. And we also know that the stress, people also tell me they've seen, last year I was hearing kids in the middle school, they're saying there's fights on the playground. This never happened. Like, this is because their brain is stressed. They don't have the same capacities to manage that executive function of that self-regulation. And so they act out in those ways. So it's so important for us to really have that empathy and compassion for our children, for how they're acting and what they've experienced. And I think to prioritize the social and emotional aspect, the learning will catch up. I love your slow teaching, Maureen, but we really, really have to think seriously about how to help that. And now Molly's sharing the brain. Now we have the brain evidence of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you both. There is a question that I really is dear to my heart that love to hear your response. So you've connected CASEL's work to our curriculum and to our competencies. Can you make any comments about the connection to the early learning framework? And of course, there's direct connection through the pathways. But either of you have any comments about that?
Yes, it's related. I just know I was brought in on the conversation early on, Maureen. Thank you very much, of the early learning framework, and thinking it was embedded right from the very start and integrated. And, and this is what I love when we talk about with early childhood educators, is so much of what we're talking about is really the mindset of early childhood educators, the idea of of prioritizing the social and emotional competence and well-being of students. I think what hasn't been prioritized, however, are the educators themselves and their well-being. I could go on forever to talk about how that hasn't been something that has been actually given us much attention. And I was looking early on, someone had asked a question about we talk about teachers and their stress and burnout, and the stress and burnout, 52% in the Gallup poll, but I don't know of a study. In fact, I'd have to look to see, is there anything looking at the well-being and stress and well-being of the early childhood educators?
Okay, thank you. And just, so exciting, because when we did that, the draft, and then it was finalized, the early learning framework goes from birth to age 8. So it no longer stops with early childhood educators. It's actually a document to be used by primary teachers as well. And all the things you've stated, the importance of the environment, relationships, sense of identity, really paying attention to the holistic development of all of our children, sense of voice, all of those are woven into the pathways in the early learning framework. So whoever wrote that, and I super appreciate you holding that up, because really important to remember that is an incredibly important document. segueing into just what you just were talking about, Kim, tell us more about the role of adults in SEL and mental health and the importance of the educator. And we're seeing that in the work we're doing with changing results for young children, of which, Kim, you've been a lead advisor for since it started 6 years ago, really bringing together early childhood educators and primary teachers. And what we've seen is the importance of the shift to pay attention to the well-being of the adult. So in particular, over these last 3 years. So any comments either one of you would have in thinking about the role of the adults in SEL and mental health?
I can start, and then I know Kim's gonna have lots to say as well. Yeah, so I over the last number of years, it's become more apparent, not just anecdotally, but through the science, how vital that is. And I usually bring up a framework by Tish Jennings and Mark Greenberg that came out in 2009, the pro-social classroom, which really placed the educator at the beginning of everything. So being able to set the tone for successful SEL program implementation, developing those healthy classroom environments, being able to foster healthy teacher-student relationships and peer relationships, and then getting out to the more, longer term outcomes around well-being and success, both academically and socially, emotionally. So we know the evidence is there. There's science that suggests that teachers who are do not have high levels of personal, social, emotional competencies are not well equipped to deliver social and emotional learning programming and practices that you can actually do harm. And certainly Kim's research around stress contagion is vitally important for us to be aware of. And I want to just say that I say this without wanting to put more on teachers. I'm not saying this to say like, well, you have to be this perfect, levitating individual that, you never get stressed and you never have issues. What I'm saying is that systemically, if we think about systemic SEL, we need to support teachers in providing them with the resources they need, with the support from leadership and admin to have those, whether it's professional learning or access to resources around developing social emotional competence. That's vitally important to work together. So that's my initial thoughts. Kim.
Yeah, I just think, I think so much of our focus on the research that really has emerged is the importance of teachers, the importance of teachers' well-being, their social emotional competence, the importance of teachers' presence in the classroom and how they are, and how even how students notice how teachers are stressed. I mean, students are picking that up, as we know in the stress contagion article. But we also know is that there are programs and practices that can support teacher well-being. There's now been a flurry of recent approaches, and I have to say MindUP has one of them, the MindUP for Educators program, and other ones across the CARE program, Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education. So I do think that it's important for us to think about, there is something to do about it. However, I also don't want to say it's as easy as just give the teachers are stressed, let's just give them a program and it'll fix it all, because there's larger systemic different things that are happening. And we really need to have larger policy and societal and many different layers to support educators. So anyway, so there's just a couple of things, as Molly said, I could have lots to say about this.
Right, and coming back to Molly's comment, leadership so matters. When you've got it woven into a school district's strategic plan around social and emotional learning, when you can refer to policy at the Ministry of Education and Childcare, when you watch what's being funded around new early learning and childcare initiatives, when you take a look at BC Ministry of Education and Childcare focusing on compassionate systems leadership. So, even when you think of it from a leadership position, just reinforcing for teachers who have had teachers and early childhood educators, we need to be talking about both, and really, reinforcing the importance of social and emotional well-being, social and emotional learning. And yes, it needs to be in your classrooms. And yes, we need to see it, because sometimes there's a pressure from some leadership that's focused on only the academics versus really thinking about the holistic development of the most important resource we have in the world, and that's our children.
Right.
So moving to our next question. Oh, actually, there was a great question in the chat. Any research around the connection between social emotional learning, amount of cell time, amount of screen time, anything that you have on the top of your head around research related to that?
I mean, I can bring forward more thinking about mental health research examining, specifically with adolescents and social media. We know that there's a problematic connection there between social media use, particularly one study I'm thinking about looked at, I think, Instagram, and use of that and increased feelings of sadness and thoughts of suicide, in particular for teen girls. So again, not a causal study, but there's a correlation there that I think we need to be aware of. And I wonder, coming out of our pandemic, our kids, linking back to Kim's comments on, developmentally at that period in their lives, they need to be socializing with one another. And the only way to do that for a period of time was online. So I don't have all of the answers. I kind of want to jump off and go do an article search on this right now. I'll have to hold off. But they're kind of a guinea pigs in this. What has happened and how did that impact their socialization just by solely having, online relationships. I know for my kids, like personal experience, when we were in no school and lockdown, and I have to say we were so fortunate in British Columbia that for our children to be able to be in schools for as much as they were throughout that pandemic, even though it was extremely stressful. My two, for a period of time, their only way to connect with their friends was through online games like Roblox and things. So, and I kind of was okay with it because it was a way to be social. But again, I want to go and do a little lit review search to see what's out there.
Yeah, and I'm not as familiar with that. I mean, certainly, it's an interesting thing in terms of screen time, because I know, so I just want to mention, there's actually an emerging area of some I Thrive games, for example, and some of these games that are coming out that are screen time, that are social and emotional learning programs where kids work together, collaborating, go and save the world and do, so there's, so I want to say, so it's not, it's all bad or it's all good or whatever. It's nuanced. It's, it's like also programming that kids watch. So I think that it's interesting because I think for some of the kids getting into the screen time, the gaming and things like that, gamifying social emotional learning programs that engage kids is a way to hook some of them in. So anyway, and those programs have shown some pretty positive outcomes as well.
Okay, thank you. So any comments when you think about, again, our ministry changing and integrating these two sectors of childcare and school-based educators? Any comments on how the level of importance of really thinking about teaching social and emotional learning at an early age? What difference does that make?
Well, I'm just
starting early.
Changes their brains, I have to say. So, I sort of alluded to the fact that there's these certain times in development that are particularly plastic, that have more, it's kind of more ready to soak things up, and we know the early years are one time, and especially the ages 3 to 5 are a time of heightened neuroplasticity, brain development, and also is the time where the whole idea of developing a whole understanding of emotions and making the connection between emotions, how you feel and what you are seeing, and that really is a really important time of early development. And so is what we know is those early years matter so much. for future success. And I have to say that other study that I talked about, where they found that kindergarten, those kids who had the pro-social skills in kindergarten were more likely to have all these successful adult outcomes. So we know how critical those are.
And I would add, thinking about really supporting early years and making it part of the ministry is so vital for families and building those communities. As you as a parent, as you move through the system of education, you're in the building less and less as they get older, but you're really in that building when they're little and wee. You're dropping off, you're hugging, you're meeting the teachers, you're having that conversation. How was the day? There's so much more contact. So I just think of the opportunity there to provide additional support and learning for families who are, when you bring that baby home, there's no booklet that you get, instruction book, right? That's the old joke. So here's an opportunity where we can support these families and give them strategies and tips as well. So it can be really that community family partnership that's so vital. So I'm excited about it. And I want to just really call out the work that you've been doing, Maureen, and making all of this happen. And so how fabulous it is for families today in the province to be given these opportunities.
And to really trust that these kids have so much competence, right? They have so much competence. I mean, really, they will just soak up anything, right? And we need to be those adults that are doing that role modeling, no matter what role we're playing. So a final question, just paying attention to the time, in your experience, like what are some of the greatest misconceptions about social emotional learning, and any advice on how we, in whatever role we play, can mitigate them?
I can jump in first, Molly. I want to say that, if I think of some of the criticisms of social and emotional learning, certainly that, the purpose of schooling is the academics, that we need to focus on the reading and the math and the science, and that adding in social and emotional learning takes away from those important goals. And I then reply and say, well, actually, first of all, the notion of integrating social and emotional learning into education is not new. That if you go even back to Aristotle from centuries ago, that educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. And second of all, that no matter what we do, we're teaching kids social and emotional skills because we're social. So they're watching how adults respond to stress. They're getting along, they're either getting in fights or getting along on the playground. They're learning social and emotional skills. They are, no matter what. And so why let it happen and not happen very well? And why not just focus more intentionally? Because that's, how they learn, through these social interactions. And so that's one important point. It's something part of the hidden curriculum, this idea that it is so much a part of education embedded within that. And then we also have the critics who say, this is really something you're teaching values, or you're teaching, you're trying to brainwash kids. I mean, I'll say there's a whole rhetoric in the US now, really trying to, co-opt kids and brainwash them, to not be the way they think they should be. And I think what I respond again is that really children are learning these social emotional skills. It's an integral part. We have the science now that shows that it leads to not only better success in adulthood, better relationships, better health, so really if you think about it in some ways, the science of physical fitness, we now have a whole bunch of research that says we know we need every day to have physical fitness, to exercise, to be able to keep active. It leads to longevity. It leads to stress reduction. I think in the same way we talk about that, we now have the science that tells us that every day we should be building our social and emotional skills. In the same way we intentionally do things like brushing our teeth, that we do things that are going to help us develop our self-awareness, our relationship skills. So I just think it's an essential part of development.
And of the process of becoming. And that's what education is, right? Fundamentally all about. This is about the process of becoming. Molly, any final comments from you?
I would just, double highlight what you both just said, and just sort of reiterate that SEL isn't the extra thing. It is the curriculum. It is in the curriculum, and it's part of supporting kids to become, as you said, Maureen, and to be able to learn. So we know that kids who are under stress or don't feel they're connected or don't feel they belong are not able to learn and take advantage of their education. So SEL is really that foundational piece to provide that place of equity for education. So that's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Molly. So it's 2:24. I just really want to highlight HELP website is a absolutely incredible resource to go to. I'd also like to highlight the CASEL, CASEL website. There is a multiplicity of resources there. And so if you haven't had an opportunity to visit that and you're looking for resources to support a systemic implementation, a classroom implementation, a school implementation, a school district implementation, honestly, the resources there are just extensive. And, to all of you for being here today, Kim's going to close, but on behalf of all of us, just to say thank you for carving out the time. And to all of you on this call, I know you're here because you know the importance of really focusing on the heart. So thank you so much for joining us. And Kim, I'm going to ask you to close.
Yes, thank you so much, Maureen. Well, this has been such a joy and pleasure to be with my best friends, really, Maureen, Molly, Denise, and to be able to share this information. I really want to reiterate for you how BC is a leader in the world. British Columbia has really been a pioneer in integrating it and taking the risk of putting it into the school system at a policy level. I know you probably feel that, in some ways, well, we're not doing as much as we could. Yes, we'll always continue to be better, but really, thanks to all of you and your interest and your curiosity and your hard work and determination in really making social and emotional learning such an integral part of our system in British Columbia. I just want to thank you all again. We are having, as I said, the next session is January 26th. Please follow the link. It's that opportunity where you'll hear about some of the specific research findings about implementation of a mindfulness-based SEL program, learning from the teachers and learning from the students as well. So I really just, again, want to thank you and wish you a wonderful day. And hopefully you'll be able to come to our next session. Thank you. I'm reading some of the chat. It's really nice, all of it. I see some familiar names, Maureen.
Yeah, and I honestly, warms my heart to see how many people are on here in those district early learning and childcare lead positions. We have 56 out of 60 school districts that have this position. And to see so many of these folks that have joined us today is just heartwarming.
It's wonderful.